Who wants to hear a spoiler? You will die alone.
What the fuck?
You guys remember ALF? ALF was a sitcom that ran from 1986 to 1990 on NBC, created by Tom Patchett and Paul Fusco. The show was about an alien named Gordon Shumway, nicknamed ALF for alien lifeform, crash landing into the garage of the Tanner family. With no way of repairing his spaceship and his home planet of Melmac destroyed, ALF has to hide from the general public while getting into all kinds of wacky sitcom antics with the Tanner family. The initial first 2 seasons of the show were a hit, thanks in part to Paul Fusco's performance as the titular character of ALF, but also thanks to how he bounced off of the Tanners, including the warm father Willie, the stern mother Kate, the bubbly teenager Lynn, and the naive son Brian. You know, this is like the second video in a row that I've made where there's a character in the show named after me. I swear I'm not vain. ALF quickly became an icon of the late 80s and early 90s. He had an animated television spin-off, comic books, and Pogs. Now see, Pogs is how you know you've made it. Now I didn't grow up when ALF was first on. I was born around the late 90s. But around the mid-2000s, my parents decided to buy the entire series on DVD, just because there was a character in it named after me. I shit you not, the only reason that my parents got like any of these is because there was a character named after me. Maybe that's why I'm so vain. I was initially put off by the DVD cover. I thought ALF was like a horror movie or something. But when I sat down and watched it, I started to have a great time. ALF was so appealing to my younger self. I was pulled in not just by the puppet work of ALF and the types of funny situations he got himself into, but I was so enthralled with the Tanner family as characters. It was probably because I too was living in a suburban household, so I related a lot to the environment and the kinds of characters that showed up. Paul Fusco's puppet work of ALF is great, but I really loved the dad Willie Tanner, played by the late great Max Wright. His straight man banter with ALF was hilarious, but he had this warmth to him that really made you believe in the family dynamic that was put in place. To me, you came for ALF, you stayed for the family. Now there were a lot of episodes of ALF that I loved as a kid, but I will admit, looking back for this video, a lot of the episodes haven't aged well, not because of like the subject matter or anything, but like the show tended to make like a lot of 80s reference humor that even today still goes over my head.
I don't want Shauna. I want Mrs. Bates.
Did you see Dog Day Afternoon? Can you roll Animal House for the blue station wagon?
We don't need an exterminator. We need Sigourney Weaver.
Letterman would have a field day with this one. Ha! Ed McMahon will love that. I was helping him with his Katharine Hepburn impression. I take it you didn't see the end of Butch Cassidy either.
Who do you think I am? Dagwood Bumstead?
Who? Still though, there are many episodes of ALF that resonated with me in so many ways. The pilot where ALF arrives on Earth, the episode where ALF has to avoid being seen by the babysitting neighbor Mrs. Akamanik, Willie trying to finish a skydive he did in his youth, ALF versus a giant cockroach from his spaceship, the one where Brian has to learn to stand up to a bully. It's me every day with you guys. ALF steering the neighbor kid away from crime, the time ALF gets mistaken for a burglar while trapped in the Akamanik's house, the Christmas special, which we'll talk about later, the crossover with Gilligan's Island, ALF ending up in a car while on one of Lynn's dates, ALF convincing Kate's alcoholic friend to stop drinking, the one where the baby Eric was born, the one where the family goes treasure hunting in the desert, and one of my favorites, the silent movie episode, which ends in one of the greatest punchlines ever.
I can talk!
Brilliant. God, there are just so many episodes of the show that I still remember so vividly. I can go on and on, but there's one episode in particular that I remember over all of them. Season 4, episode 24, Consider Me Gone. In this episode, ALF finally gets in contact with his surviving friends from Melmac, and after having a heartfelt goodbye to each and every one of the Tanners, is about to finally leave the Earth to start a new life. But then he's surrounded by the alien task force, and his friends leave him behind to get taken in by the authorities. Well, what a shocking ending. ALF has just been apprehended by the very people he's been actively avoiding the entire series. What happens next? What happens to the Tanners? This was the final episode of the show. Yeah, you feel that disappointment? That's how I felt. This was quite a shock for a lot of people watching the show, I'm sure. Alf was canceled, and the series as a whole just kind of ended. His spin-offs ended around the same time, his comic run ended, and Alf as a character quickly fell into obscurity. So, what happened exactly? To discover why Alf was ultimately taken off the air, I looked into what co-creator Paul Fusco had to say about the show being canceled. He stated in an interview that the main reason for Alf's cancellation was because the FCC had created a law that stated that networks were unable to create their own shows for distribution, which is why they resorted to purchasing independent shows like Alf and airing them on their platforms.
Originally, the networks were producing their own shows, and they were putting them on the networks, and the government came in and said, you can't do this anymore. And they had to go out and get people to do the shows for them, which is what was going on when we did it. And then they changed the law again.
Now, after hearing Paul say this, I immediately went, huh? Because I was always under the assumption that NBC had its own production company because they made shows like The Tonight Show and Saturday Night Live. I tried to verify this by searching for the specific law that Fusco was talking about. And instead of jumping down a rabbit hole, I kind of fell into what can only be described as a rabbit net? You see, I couldn't find anything related to such a law, and anything I could find just brought me back into an endless cycle of confusion. A friend of mine sent me an old article detailing the FCC becoming more lax when it comes to delegating television production, but this article came out in 1995, not the year that ALF was canceled in 1990. I can only assume, based on what Fusco was discussing, that either the FCC had some kind of rule in place that stated that networks needed a percentage of independent productions on their platforms, or that all of NBC studios were marked as independent in order to skirt around the FCC's rules and regulations. But with those actual production companies being labeled as NBC Productions and NBC Studios, I seriously doubt that. I'm completely willing to bite the bullet though and accept that I could be wrong about this subject, so if anybody has an answer to what Fusco is actually talking about, please let me know. But really, I think the most likely reason that ALF was canceled was because of a factor that drives a lot of these decisions.
Money!
By the 4th season of the show, ALF was just not making enough money to keep it going. During the 2nd season, the Nielsen ratings, remember those, for ALF were at an all-time high, placing 10th place, before crashing down around the 30 mark around the 4th season. So they ended up giving ALF's spot to a new show called The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, with a young Will Smith. And let me tell you, if I could go back in time and tell a young Will Smith anything, is that I would tell him to run if he ever saw himself a red table. Do you get it? But hey, if ALF were an independent production, couldn't they just sell it to another network? I mean, Taxi was originally on ABC before it went to NBC, so maybe they could have just worked out a deal to move ALF to a network for a newer audience. Besides, ALF was already appealing to kids, so maybe they could have just moved it to a network that kids were more likely to go to. Well, that would have worked if the people working on this show actually wanted to do more episodes anyway. If there's one thing that ALF is infamous for, it's for the show's hectic production. Due to the complex nature of integrating the puppet into the sets of the show, ALF quickly became notorious for its long production hours and grueling conditions.
We're in sitcom hell.
The first season was even worse, as they originally attempted to use a live studio audience at one point, not to mention that they had to halt in between takes for little person actor Michu Meseros to do full-body shots in an ALF costume. Apparently working on the show was so stressful that Max Wright physically assaulted the ALF puppet in a rage. Okay, I think that story was greatly exaggerated because it just sounds funny out of context, but the point is, Wright and many of the other actors really didn't like working on set, supposedly. A lot of horror stories related to the set of ALF have been denied by some people who have worked on the show. With the exception of one set of dailies that leaked on the internet in recent years where Paul Fusco was being blinded by dry ice, there really isn't too much damning evidence of a bad set. Wait, now that I'm saying that out loud, yeah, that does kind of sound shitty. Okay, yeah, I get it now. We may never know the full extent of how bad the set was, but the point is, the show definitely created a reputation in the industry, which most likely resulted in a number of companies rejecting the idea of taking on ALF. Plus, from what I've seen of other creatives who have worked with the ALF puppet over the years, it seems like he wasn't the best to work with.
The guy that works ALF, he doesn't like to ever break the illusion. He doesn't want anyone to know that ALF is a puppet. So he doesn't even want the live audience to see him operating the puppet. So we had to talk to him several times on the phone and reassure him and build this whole big thing in the set, like a big trap door and all this stuff. But I'm gonna tell you right now, Alf is a puppet.
How dare you!
Thus, with these factors in place, a 5th season of ALF never came to be. This ultimately leads us to the question of, how was ALF supposed to end? If a 5th season was in development at some point and was originally intended to go in a new direction, what would the follow-up have looked like? I looked high and low and I figured out that the only way to find out how the show was going to end was by reaching out to somebody who had actually worked on the show. And I think I found the right person. My fellow Brian, Benji Gregory. That's right, I got the real-life Benji Gregory, the actor who actually worked on the ALF show in the 80s and early 90s, to answer the question of how was ALF supposed to end. So without further ado, here you go.
All right, everybody, I am joined today by the legendary actor Benji Gregory. Benji, thanks so much for joining me. I'm not going to waste any more time. I'm just going to ask you point blank, how was ALF supposed to end?
Well, I mean, you see, season 5 was actually going to follow the Tanner family in prison for hiding Alf, and Willie was going to be beaten brutally while his children were forced to watch. And I, well, as Brian Tanner, of course, would become the leader of a gang, and the gang would have escaped the prison. And Brian, well, he'd go off to work on a documentary crew while the rest of the Tanners were executed by the firing squad. And also, Alf was going to be experimented on by the government until he died from loneliness.
I don't think that was the real Benji Gregory. Well, with the 5th season being canceled years ago and nobody around to answer the question of how it was supposed to go, I guess we'll never find out how ALF was supposed to end. After all, it's not like there was a TV movie that came out 6 years later that I've been neglecting to talk about because it's really bad, right? Right? Alright, I know I've been dancing around this, but yes, there was a TV movie called Project ALF that came out 6 years after the final episode of the original series. Better late than never. I mean, hey, development hell can be a real bitch sometimes, so I get it. In the mid-90s, Paul Fusco and Tom Patchett were approached by ABC to do a spiritual finale to the show, which in turn would act as a backdoor pilot for a new series. This didn't end up happening, though, as Project ALF didn't do as well as they had hoped, which placed ALF back into the void of obscurity. But hey, it's still good that the two of them managed to make something like this at all, considering how their original series ended. Sadly, though, Project ALF is not exactly what I would call the ideal ending to the series. Well, time for me to put on my nostalgia critic costume and tell you why this movie is not that good. I couldn't find a plain black cap. We're representing America for this review, okay? All right, here we go. Just do the thing. So Project ALF takes place 6 years after Alf was taken in by the alien task force. And despite him being captured and imprisoned in a military base, he's actually doing pretty well for himself by running a makeshift casino with some of the base's guards. This actually kind of works for me because Alf as a character in the show was always like way in over his head. So seeing him end up with like some level of like competence in this like movie actually kind of works for his character. Although this is separate from his actual personality, which believe me, we'll talk about in a sec. The real question here though is what happened to the Tanner family after the events of the show? Well, as explained by Martin Sheen here, after Alf was taken in, the Tanners were placed into the Witness Protection Program, and they now reside in Iceland.
Well, are they happy
They're
with
fine, ma'am. The rest is classified.
And that's it! That's the last time the Tanner family is ever mentioned again. Okay, that's fine. The actors were probably off doing their own thing after the show, and the two kid actors are already like older at this point, so if they're gone, who are they replaced with? Well, in their place, we got Colonel Rick Mullican and Major Melissa Hill, who are both so forgettable that I straight up had to look up their names multiple times while writing this script. These two are probably the worst part of the film, and they're a big part of it. The entire movie, we are subjected to a by-the-numbers will-they-won't-they dynamic that's just so lame to watch.
There's this bit where Alf is jumping on the bed in a motel, because I guess he's like 5 years old now. Anyway, it leads to a massive, wacky misunderstanding where a neighbor thinks they're actually having sex. If that sounds like you've heard it before, congratulations, you have. So the premise of this film is that Martin Sheen's character Colonel Milfoil wants to secretly kill Alf due to his hatred of aliens, which leads to Rick and Melissa attempting to take Alf to Dexter Moyers, a former NASA scientist who wants to expose Alf to the world. Dexter also has a robot butler, so if you like Rocky IV... No, you don't.
Can't think of anything you don't have.
Napkins.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
But really, Dexter Moyers wants to sell him to the highest bidder by exposing him to a television audience. I don't know why he would expose him to the world only to then sell him as property. I mean, wouldn't it be weird if someone exposed an alien being to the world only to have them disappear? Wouldn't that create an international conflict of interest? And could they even sell him as property if he has human characteristics? You know, I'm probably thinking way too hard about an 80s icon who really only exists to sell Burger King toys. Okay, so the premise isn't very deep, but that's fine. Most of the original series wasn't either. Is the movie at least funny?
We're going really slowly.
Well, I think we should. I mean, you're my superior, and I didn't know how you felt.
No, I mean, we're going 2 miles an hour.
Yeah, let's just say that the lack of a laugh track really isn't doing this film that many favors.
You find him to be a bit humorless.
It wasn't that funny.
Hey, you said it, not me. The beginning montage of Alf being interviewed by scientists is actually where the movie shines the most. The humor in it makes it feel like it was directly pulled from the original series. With the exception of one bit in particular.
Here is the first word.
Go ahead.
No, here. The word here is the first word.
It wasn't that funny.
Hey, you said it, not me. I do find it weird that the actress playing Dr. Carnage was also the same one who played the Tanner's neighbor, Mrs. Bird, back in season 2 of the show. Maybe she was actually an undercover agent for the government sent to keep tabs on the Tanners after Mrs. Ochmonek ratted them out to the alien task force in the pilot? Again, Burger King. To wrap up the actual plot, though, after finding out that Dexter Moyers is up to no good, Rick calls in Colonel Milfoil to raid Moyers' compound right before he exposes the alien to the world. With Milfoil in custody of Alf, Rick manages to record Milfoil stating that he is planning to pin the whole thing on his assistant, which is not good. With the evidence being shared to higher authorities, Milfoil is discharged and Rick and Melissa get promoted. I guess they also keep Dr. Moyers' robot. I'm not even going to ask why at this point, but if this robot was supposed to show up in the follow-up series to this, then hoo boy, am I glad they didn't go anywhere with all of this.
I'm in robot hell.
Hey, you said it, not me. Alf is made an ambassador of Earth or some shit, and that's the end. Also, did I mention that Alf is in this movie?
Do you remember?
Alright guys, I've been saving my biggest issue with this film for last. My biggest problem with this movie is Alf himself. Alf is an insufferable character in this movie, and I'll admit, in some episodes of the show, he was insufferable there as well. But the thing is that in every episode of the show, Alf learned something of some importance that made him feel like an actual character. In this movie, Alf doesn't learn anything, and honestly, if you removed him from the story, not much would change. Which is weird because the story also revolves around him. It's so weird. He doesn't seem to care that the Tanner family, the people he spent 4 years of his life with, are gone forever. It feels like there are hints of that throughout, but the film never capitalizes on it. Instead, we get bits of him disregarding the fact that he's supposed to be killed, sneaks out to go to strip bars, and focuses on how he's going to look once he's exposed to the world. Now, I understand that maybe he's been locked away for such a long time, so as a character, he's a little bit more antsy to get out there and cause trouble, but that's such a stretch just to make him less of the developed character that he became over the course of the entire show. Hey guys, Post Brian here. So while editing this video, I realized that the ALF comic book series made by Marvel, it was made by Marvel, actually ran into 1992, 2 years after the sitcom was canceled. So out of morbid curiosity, I decided to look at the final issue of the comic run to see if it had any kind of alternate ending to the series that the sitcom itself didn't have? And the answer is, well, no, not really. Instead, we get this weird crossover where Alf's girlfriend from the animated series comes to Earth to get married. And she doesn't get married to Alf. She gets married to a friend of Alf's named Skip, and Alf marries the two of them. Man, talk about getting cucked. I take it that this means that the Alf comics are in their own separate continuity from the show, so I'm not going to look at it. Although I did read a few, and man, this comic is batshit insane. There's an issue in which Kate's uncle from Ireland comes to visit, and he's just straight up a leprechaun. Or at least he's like a caricature of all these Irish stereotypes. And I can't tell if it's more racist if he is a leprechaun or not. I'm really conflicted here. I don't know. Not to be cynical or anything, but I get the feeling reading this comic that these writers really didn't know what to do with this property. Anyway, I just realized that I'm giving myself more work, so let's just get back to the main video. I want to take this time to circle back and look at one of my favorite episodes of the show, that being Alf's Special Christmas. It's Christmas Eve, and the Tanner family heads up to a cabin belonging to Mr. Foley, a man who previously let a younger Willie Tanner and his family spend Christmas after Willie's father lost his job. Willie hopes to recreate the magic of his favorite Christmas with his family. However, Alf gets in the way with his usual Alfness. Due to some sitcom antics, Alf finds himself in the back of a visiting Mr. Foley's truck. This results in him pretending to be a toy that Mr. Foley ends up taking to the hospital as part of his yearly tradition of visiting the sick children. Alf ends up in the possession of a young girl named Tiffany, who he reveals his identity to in hopes of getting back to the Tanners. Their plan to have Foley taken back succeeds, but before Alf can properly leave the hospital with Mr. Foley, he learns something that he would never hear in a normal episode of the show. This is going to be Tiffany's last Christmas. Upon hearing this, Alf throws away any hope of getting back to his family to return to Tiffany's room. And Alf just talks to her. This isn't treated like a parody. Alf doesn't make any joke at Tiffany's expense. He treats her like a longtime friend and takes the time to assure her that everything will be alright. Concurrent to the main plot, the Tanners try searching for Alf in the woods, which leads to one of my favorite moments of Willie assuring his son Brian that Alf will come home.
Dad,
Yeah.
is Alf coming home?
He's coming home. I'm sure he's coming home.
This right here is so simple and elegant, and may be one of the greatest bits of acting from Max Wright. It is such a small moment, but it greatly encapsulates the love that Willie has for his family. Alf finds himself back in Mr. Foley's truck. The episode previously makes mention to the fact that Mr. Foley's wife, Margaret, passed away 2 weeks prior, which is why Mr. Foley plans to give away the cabin to Willie and his family. Mr. Foley parks on a bridge, walks outside, and gets ready to jump. And that's when Alf comes out, dressed as Santa Claus, to tell Mr. Foley something that he, as Santa, told the young girl Tiffany back at the hospital. That Christmas is not about what you get, but what you give of yourself. After convincing Mr. Foley not to jump, Alf reunites with the Tanners, and the next morning, the family pays a visit to Tiffany, bringing her one last Christmas gift. And after all of that, we are greeted with this. Alf's Special Christmas is unlike any special I've ever seen. It encapsulates everything I loved about the character of Alf. Yes, he's goofy. Yes, he's a puppet, but he as a character uses his own status as an alien from another world to help people however he can. While working on the show, Paul Fusco did everything in his power to make Alf seem like a real person by barely making any public appearances himself. He wanted Alf to seem real. He pulled from his own experiences to make Alf seem like a real-life character with likes, dislikes, a backstory, the whole thing. And that's why, as a kid, I loved Alf. He was real. he had a heart. While dealing with heavy subject matters and coming from a real place, the special instills with you a sense of hope to get out there and do good. Project ALF doesn't make me feel anything but regret for what we could have got and embarrassment over what we actually got. ALF doesn't feel like a character anymore. He just feels like a caricature of his previous self. The Tanners are gone, and they were replaced with forgettable side characters with generic archetypes. Maybe if they had spun off into a new show, then they could have had time to develop into people that I actually care about. As it stands though, all of it just lacks heart. Project ALF is ALF without the heart. And a puppet without a heart, well, it's the same as if anybody wasn't operating it. It's just a hollow shell. And you want to know something really shocking? Before working on this video, I always assumed that the direction that Project ALF took, pushing aside the Tanners, was basically just a byproduct of the fact that it was like beyond the heyday of the original series. However, while researching this video, I learned that Project ALF had actually adapted a lot of concepts of the original scrapped 5th season. ALF was always going to be living in a military base and become involved with gambling and betting and all that other stuff. The Tanners would have just been relegated to like guest appearances every so often, and ALF would have taken on a completely different vibe.
If in fact we did come back for a 5th season, it would have been a new premise. What we were running out of storylines with Alf in the house. He was a shut-in, and it was the family, and we had to open him up to a new world.
And to be blunt, if it were like what Project ALF ended up being, I don't think it would have been good. To me, the appeal of ALF comes from putting a wacky character in an environment that most viewers can identify with. Doing this just sounded like a hassle, and honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if there were another reason that Season 5 never got the green light. Maybe it could have worked, but I don't know. I really doubt it. Here's the thing, guys. There was a short period a few years back in which I had kind of become stuck in this place, and I started to do a lot of reflecting on how my life had actually progressed at that point. And I thought if I could just go back and change one thing in my life, even if it were something so inconsequential as a goofy TV show I watched when I was younger, maybe I'd be happier. So I came up with this idea for this alternate ending to this show because I was really mad and I just wanted something good out of it. Originally, when I started working on this video, I made it with the intention of exploring this show that meant a lot to me that had an abrupt ending and offer people closure by providing the definitive conclusion that I came up with a few years back. But while working on this video, I forgot something that ALF taught me in my younger years. Sometimes, things just end. They can be taken from us without warning, and suddenly, we find ourselves in a world that we no longer understand. So what do we do then? Sit around and mope about, thinking about what could have been? No. We move on. We create new memories, new experiences. Sometimes we can't just go home. And that's okay. Project ALF is not a very good movie, and it's a bad ending to one of my favorite childhood shows. But that's okay. Heck, I think one of the things that I learned while writing this video is that the ending to the show kind of makes it a little bit more special. It kind of gives the show a reputation. A wholesome childhood show that was interrupted by this cruel and unusual ending. Now, is it satisfying? No, I don't think it is at all. Heck, I made this entire video as a way of trying to get closure. But the fact that I was able to look back at this show and talk about the impact it had on me as a kid, well, I think that's good enough. So then, one last question we need to ask ourselves is, where is Alf now? After his TV movie, Alf did end up getting a new show, but it's not what you think. In 2004, TV Land was blessed with Alf's hit talk show. That name is a lie because it was not a hit. I skimmed through 5 minutes of the first episode, which I really didn't have to do in retrospect, and by
God, it was awful.
You know what television spin-offs are? That's where they take a great show and they spin off a horrible one from it.
I think that the biggest takeaway that I got from this show was that Alf is only really funny in short bursts. And you know what? Paul Fusco must have figured this too, because after this show, he essentially put Alf on what I would like to call a cameo tour. Alf made a brief appearance in NBC's 75th anniversary event, would go on to appear in a number of commercials and talk shows over the years, and make guest appearances in shows such as Young Sheldon and Mr. Robot, for some reason. Of course, there have also been attempts to make an Alf movie at various studios that have all fallen apart for one reason or another. Then in 2022, Alf's distribution rights were bought by Shout Factory, which re-released the entire show in a new box set. By the way, if you're curious to watch or rewatch the original show, the Shout Factory box set is the definitive version. The Lionsgate box sets from the mid-2000s were fine enough for introducing me to the show, but they are heavily edited down from their original broadcast versions. These versions are the ones that are free on YouTube, for the record. Given the show's quality, either version of the episode will get you by. But hey, the broadcast version of Someone to Watch Over Me Part 2 has a joke in it in which an old woman solicits a news reporter for a one-night stand. Then a year later, Alf made an appearance on the YouTube channel of former cell phone company CEO and occasional actor, Ryan Reynolds. With Alf being bought by Shout Factory, it was confirmed that they, along with Reynolds' Maximum Effort company, would be in production of Alf-related products. Whether or not his appearances in those Mint Mobile ads will be the extent of it remains to be seen.
The future of Alf is uncertain, to say the least, but I will end the video by saying this. Alf, if you should ever find yourself crashing back onto our world, I can only hope that you can stick the landing this time. Also, just because you're a puppet, that doesn't mean you can say the N-word.
Huh?